I made 2 TikToks discussing demographics and voting, one on race and one on gender. In those videos, I stuck to data from the General Social Survey. Here, I'll be looking into that data more thoroughly and bringing in outside data. Unless specified otherwise, all data is from the General Social Survey. I'll also be looking at age trends, and finally, I'll give some thoughts on the implications for this data and what policy should be moving forward given a conservative perspective. All sources are in the description. Let's begin with age trends, which should be the least surprising and least controversial part of this video. I think natural experience tells us that older people tend to be more conservative, and the data supports this. I broke the data down from the 2000 to 2016 voters, which is displayed on screen. Ages were self-reported at the time of surveys from 2002 to 2018. Survey recipients were asked to self-report their political views from extremely conservative to extremely liberal, which I converted into a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being the most conservative and 7 the most liberal. As expected, older voters were generally more conservative. I'm not sure of the reason for the increase in liberality in the 88+ age group. I also ran a linear regression on the dataset comparing age to liberality and got the following results. These results were reflected in the voting block for every election from 2000 to 2016. Note that for all voting blocks in this video, I solely looked at the 2 main candidates. Each year, the average voter for Republican candidates was older than the average voter for Democrat candidates, and liberality was lower for voters for Republican candidates. Perhaps unsurprising as well is voting based on gender. Though some may not be aware, I think it is generally known that women tend to be more liberal and vote for Democratic candidates. Here are the distributions of political views for each gender. From left to right, bars represent extremely conservative to extremely liberal. Females are more represented in all liberal categories, and being moderate, and are less representative in all conservative categories. This is reflected in their voting patterns. Females consistently voted for Democrats in every election, though only marginally so in 2000 and 2004. Males voted for Republicans in 2000 and 2004, Democrats in 2008 and 2012, and Republicans in 2016. When males and females are broken down by political ideology, all males that identified as extremely conservative, conservative, or slightly conservative voted Republican in each election, while those who identified as slightly liberal, liberal, or extremely liberal voted Democrat. Moderates voted Republican in 2000 and Democrat in 2004 to 2016. Females generally voted by political ideology, with the exception of 2016, in which females that identified as slightly conservative voted Democrat, though 2012 was also close with 48% of slightly conservative females voting Democrat. Comparatively, female liberals were generally less likely to flip and vote Republican than male liberals, and female moderates voted Democrat from 2000 to 2016. What this tells us is that females skew towards voting Democrat even when you control for political ideology. While they generally do vote based on ideology, female conservatives and moderates are much more likely to vote Democrat than their corresponding male counterparts. Furthermore, males tend to vote more strictly on ideology across the board, and male moderates are more balanced than females. There are a number of possible explanations for these disparities. One is perceived sexism in the Republican Party, which could cause females to vote Democrat. Regardless of whether the sexism is occurring in the Republican Party, a media narrative that it exists could skew the vote. Another possibility is that women tend to be more empathetic and more emotional than men. While I think common experience demonstrates this, I've included studies on this in the description. More empathy and emotion could increase female likelihood to support progressive taxation and increase immigration, as they sympathize with minority groups. Women also tend to know less about politics than men, which would make their vote skew more towards latent bias and emotion rather than current events and policy. A survey by the Economic and Social Research Council in 2013 found women on average to be less likely to answer questions correctly on recent international events. In the UK, US, and Canada, women's scores were more than 30% lower than men's scores. In Greece, Italy, and Korea, women's scores were 20% lower. While full data is unavailable, ratios of correct answer to questions for men and women for the 10 countries surveyed were provided by The Guardian. As can be seen, men scored consistently higher than women in all countries. This is not a unique phenomenon to this survey. Marta Frail in 2014 published a paper in the journal Social Politics, using 2009 data from the European election studies, and found similar results. Frail writes, quote, "The gender gap is so well established in the literature that it is part of what is commonly referred to as the usual suspects in explaining political knowledge. Numerous studies have confirmed this general pattern." End quote. Race is certainly the most controversial topic in voting demographics. Many outright deny the realities of disparities in race and voting. Others argue that the disparities are entirely due to cultural differences or political views. Such opinions are in denial of evidence. When races are broken down by political ideology, it becomes clear that there are two outliers in the data. Whites in America are the least liberal by a somewhat significant margin relative to the other differences between races. I've included this graph with this scale to show how comparable it is to previous graphs on gender and age that use the same scale of 3.5 to 5 on liberality rating. However, in order to include the second outlier, I had to make a second graph with a different scale. The current graph is only the non-Jewish population. When the Jewish population is added, the scale must be adjusted to accommodate for the second outlier. Out of curiosity, I broke down the Jewish population by denomination and found the following results. Orthodox Jews are the most conservative of any demographic analyzed in this video, but conservative, Reform, and other Jews, which include small denominations and secular Jews, are more liberal than any other demographic analyzed, with conservative Jews coming in slightly more conservative than the average Jew surveyed, and Reform and other Jews being strikingly liberal. When looking at individual elections, I broke voting down into non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, and Hispanics. Other races were left out due to small sample size, particularly when races are divided into political ideology for each election. To be clear, the non-Hispanic white sample in these graphs includes any who identified as white on the survey question about race, but not Hispanic on the second survey question. This sample thus includes some who identified as Jewish or Arab in other questions of the survey, which skew these results slightly towards Democrat voting and liberal ideology, though I think this only has a nominal effect given that Arabs and Jews were not a large portion of the white sample. Keep in mind that if Arab and Jewish populations were removed from the white sample in this data, the results would likely be slightly more conservative. In the following graphs, white bars represent non-Hispanic whites, black bars, non-Hispanic blacks, and gray bars, Hispanics. In this sample, we find that the white population voted Republican in 2000, 2004, and 2016, and Democrat in 2008 and 2012, while black and Hispanic populations voted Democrat in all elections. One might expect from the previous data to find that this was due to their left-wing skew. This accounts for some of the voting disparity. However, the data makes it clear this is far from the only factor. On screen are voting patterns by political ideology. As expected, on the whole, those who identified as extremely conservative, conservative, or slightly conservative voted Republican in each election, while those who identified as slightly liberal, liberal, or extremely liberal voted Democrat in each election. Moderates voted Republican in 2000, and Democrat in all other elections. When non-Hispanic whites are isolated, this pattern holds true as well, except the moderates voted Republican in 2000, 2004, and 2016, and Democrat in 2008 and 2012. This pattern holds for Hispanics in 2000 and 2004, but not in other years. In 2008, all Hispanics voted Democrat regardless of ideology, except for the group that identified as conservative, but those that identified as extremely conservative or slightly conservative voted Democrat. In 2012, slightly conservative Hispanics voted Democrat, while those who were more conservative had very close results, leaning slightly Republican. In 2016, slightly conservative Hispanics voted Democrat. In all elections from 2000 to 2016, moderates voted Democrat. Most striking is the data on non-Hispanic black populations. In all elections from 2000 to 2016, blacks voted Democrat across the board, regardless of ideology, and with striking unanimity, with many subgroups voting 90+% Democrat, even among those who identified as conservative. Whether political skew is a result of environmental factors or heritable factors is not necessarily relevant to the video. However, in case there's any uncertainty about the likelihood that voting and ideology patterns will drastically shift by debate or changing environments, I'd encourage the viewers to check out the links in the description under the heading Heritability and Political Views, or simply read studies on the subject of heritability of political views by searching on Google Scholar. Studies are in abundance, with a general consensus that political ideology is 40 to 60% heritable, and specific genes have also been identified with plausible mechanisms, in some cases, for how they lead to some ideologies. I've also included multiple articles going further into the topic of voting patterns by race in the description that are excellent, but would take far too long to cover in this video. A brief summary, however, is that identifying the cause of Black and Hispanic conservatives voting Democrat is particularly challenging, and none of the standard expected causes, such as perceived racism in the Republican Party by voters, seem to match with the data. And Blacks and Hispanics have consistently voted Democrat for many decades, regardless of how many generations the voters have lived in the United States. That is to say, the Democrat voting skew does not disappear if the voters are second or third generation US citizens. So, what does all of this mean for policy and conservatives? The most apparent and urgent issue is certainly changing demographics. White Americans have birth rates below replacement level, while we are simultaneously bringing in a large number of non-white immigrants that both hold left-wing views and vote Democrat. Even those who hold conservative views often still vote Democrat, which shows that simple debate and reason will not strongly change voting patterns, and this has held true for decades. Many states that formerly voted red now vote blue consistently after demographic change. The right wing, if it wishes to win elections and have any sort of influence in politics, needs to stop immigration. As for voting policy, an unpopular opinion in the Overton window perhaps, but a traditional opinion of old conservatives nonetheless, is to restrain voting age. Universal suffrage is a very recent change in the West. The conservatives in the old eras of feminism opposed the 19th Amendment, and this opposition should return. To quote Henry Adams, "The woman, as the cement of society, the head of the family, and the center of cohesion, has, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. She has become a wandering, isolated unit rather than a dispersive and a collective force." This is from the Degradation of the Democratic Dogma, page 119, which is free on PDF in the description. Women and men are different and are meant to handle different affairs. God has ordained this much. Men are to deal with matters of politics and leadership in society. Women are to handle childbearing and the household. Women, collectively speaking, have shown inability to vote based on policy and ideology. As conservatives, we desire a virtuous society based on reality. We don't believe in utopian ideals, or voting based on subjectivity or emotion. Policy should be grounded in reality and truth. Conservatives need to push back against the ever-rising tide of feminism and return society to an order run with men as leaders. With regard to age, it is hard to know if people become more conservative as they age or maintain the status quo while society becomes liberal around them. It could be a combination of both. However, principle still applies regarding voting on reality and truth. The US minimum voting age is 18, yet brain development is not complete until around 25. Furthermore, those who pursue higher education are often not part of the federal tax base or full-time labor force until completing education 2 to 6 years after graduating high school, which can skew opinions on economic policy. To increase voting age to 21 or later at 25 would again be in opposition to an amendment, namely the 26th. However, amendments can be repealed. An objective and clear-headed voting base is necessary to any democracy or republic. Socrates criticized democracy on the grounds that the average voter knows nothing of the government and politics. He puts forth a famous analogy describing a ship ready to sail off a voyage without a captain. Would you want the public voting on the captain, or the sailors voting on the captain? At the very least, we need the public to have a developed mind before casting their vote. We have age restrictions on almost all roles of public office, yet voting age is set to the arbitrary age of supposed adulthood. I'll leave this with a vote by Russel Kirk. The hope for democracy lay in the survival of gentlemen, leaders of their communities, superior to vulgar impulses, able to withstand most forms of legislative or extra-legal intimidation.